Port of Filey. The number of places where ships came and went on the east coast was much more varied in the past than it is today. The most ancient indications left to us of anchorages and places of refuge for ships lie in the place names that survive. The name Brigg, for example, is thought to be a derivative of a Scandinavian term meaning haven or jetty. The name is old, being mentioned in 1367 during an inquest held at Scarborough into the fate of a Flemish ship wrecked at Filey Brigg, and containing coal with 2 sacks and a pocket of uncustomed wool. The other, haven, often used in recent times of anchorages in the Humber, Barrow, Hull, etc., still occurs on the current Admiralty chart of Filey Bay. Butcher Haven and Mile Haven occur on either side of Hummonby Sands. Ella Howe Haven and Arundel Haven occur on either side of Filey. The name again is an old one. In 1318, a group of 3 ships sailing north from Boston were attacked near Scarborough. Only the 3rd ship escaped and passed with great peril to the port of Welpers Haven, near Scardyburg and Fiverley. In the medieval state papers, the term used for such places is usually portus, which, in the medieval sense, must translate as port, places where ships come and go, although to the modern reader they are little more than anchorages or refuges for ships. For example, on 27th May 1278, a writ was issued by Edward I, authorising an inquest into the claim by Gilbert de Gant, Lord of the Manor, with Richard de Malabis to have the right of Wales coming ashore in their port of Filey, saving to the king the head and tail. This suit was heard by justices in Ayr 3 years later, with John de Valibus the presiding justice, where Gilbert claimed lordship of half such wreck of sea in their port of Filey. Since the conquest, and Richard the other half by enfeoffment of Walter, son of Geiselbrigg, ancestor of Gilbert, made to Ralph de Neville, his own ancestor. The jurors gave evidence that the claimants had been in seizing of such wreck since the time of Richard I and before. In the same period there was another inquest, this time into the claim of Gilbert to whales and royal fish in his port of Hummonby, saving to the king the head and tail. This last reference might provide a hint of the origin of Milehaven's stones as the Hummonby anchorage, but the lack of other evidence must make any discussion of this inconclusive. Besides matters concerned with wreck of sea, the port of Filey figures in circular letters to the keepers of the ports in England, letters that were concerned with matters prejudicial to the state. In a letter from Edward II, dated 24th November 1323, from Ravensdale, the keepers were ordered not to permit John de Stratford or any of his men or anyone in his name to cross the sea without the king's special order and license, and to make diligent search in the matter. John had recently been sent to the court of Rome on the king's business, but had now returned to England. The king had sent Hugh the Dispenser with others to find out how John had discharged his business in Rome. John would not answer them and, refusing a summons from the king, withdrew himself by subterfuge. In 1342, Edward III sent out a similar document, referring this time to spies during the war with France. The letters were addressed in the first instance to London, with copies to mayors and bailiffs of all ports and maritime places, including Filey. These people were to make diligent scrutiny of all those who came for a passage of whom suspicion may be entertained, and to take all letters of credit and others which they may consider suspect, and send them to Chancery with all speed, detaining under safe custody until further order the persons of those who bear such letters, as the king has learned that there are several spies upon his secrets in England, and others who send letters to France and elsewhere to forewarn the king's enemies. On 26th December 1364, Edward again sent out letters to the various keepers of the English ports. Among them he included Scarborough, Flamborough, Kilnsea, Withensea, Hornsea, Whitby, and Simon Milner and John Page of Filey. Their orders were to allow no one to cross the sea without the King's special licence, and any who had such a licence were to take no gold or silver in money or mass, nor were they to take jewels or letters of exchange. Any so doing were to be arrested and sent before the King and Council. Merchants crossing on business were to be accepted, provided they found surety with the bailiffs before they went. Any breaking of the surety would involve the sender in forfeiture of his goods, and the bearer would be imprisoned and ransomed at the King's will. No letters patent, bulls, instruments, or processes prejudicial to the realm were to go in or out of the land. Any going abroad to the court of Rome or elsewhere with the King's licence were to find security before the King in Chancery that he would not attempt anything prejudicial to the realm. The last of these documents is dated 5th December 1384. Richard II, writing from Westminster, appointed searchers to cover the same matters as those of 1364, but this time Robert de Rillington and William Cater were to operate from Scarborough, south to Flamborough, and north to the Tees. Filey had no separate searchers. From this time onwards, the comparative importance of Scarborough, Whitby, and Hull becomes more noticeable, with mention of the smaller refuges and anchorages becoming much more scarce. References to the port of Filey only appear again during the reign of Elizabeth I, during a campaign for the suppression of pirates. 15th November 1565, the Privy Council issued instructions to commissioners. They were to investigate all aspects of port activities, the state of the port, a census of ships, licenses to sail, lists of prohibited wares, sales regulations and general restraints. With Filey, Scarborough, Flamborough and Bridlington were on the list for investigation. The results of such an inquiry were published in York on 24th February 1578, naming 22 offenders in piracy taken at Scarborough, 3 only at Filey, 2 at Whitby and 7 at Bridlington. By the time of the Dutch Wars of a century later, in the reign of Charles II, there are merely references to ships on shore in Filey Bay, by contrast with ships in harbour at Bridlington Quay. In 1701, 1707 and 1709, references to the appointment of riding officers at Filey in Scarborough Port or on the establishment of Hull Port as a further guard of the coast north of Bridlington suggest that there is sufficient activity at Filey to warrant the appointment of a watcher of the coast there. Descriptions of the anchorage at Filey that survive in pilot books of the 16th and 17th century suggest that the period saw the final lapse into disuse through silting up of the original port on the south side of the Brigg and Carnaze. The sailing directions for 1588 were that you may anchor for a north-northeast wind between the pier and Filey Bridge, which is a rock that lieth under water at spring tide. In 1625 and 1643, Filey lay in a round bay to the southwards of a point that lieth out, which hath a pier or head, where you may lie within it, but it falleth there dry at low water. Without the head of Filey lieth a rock under water called Filey Bridge. Betwixt it and the Filey Bridge you may safely lie afloat with a ship of 100 lasts in 5 fathoms at low water. A further significant, but perhaps not so impartial description of the anchorage was embodied in a petition to King Charles I, dated 11th December 1637, from Endymion Porter, groom of the bedchamber, who was seeking a harbour and lighthouse at Filey. He wrote, "There was an ancient pier on the north coast of County York called Filey Pier, which has been for many years defaced and ruined. There is a bay in the sea upon a plain firm sand, and adjoining to the said pier, some 5 or 6 miles in compass, where 600 sail may ride in safety, let the wind be in any quarter whatsoever. southeast excepted, and at low ebb has always about 3 fathoms of water in all places, upon which coast many vessels are yearly cast away for want of a harbour there to guide them into the bay, near which pier and bay there is a rock called Flamborough Head, 100 fathoms high, running nearly 6 miles in length, and so up to Filey Bridge, under which rock Dunkirks and other robbers have usually lain and robbed HM's subjects, not being discerned until ships passing that channel are within their command. The anchorage at Filey is mentioned at least 3 times in the Hummonby manorial documents. In an extent of the Lennox Manor, dated 1600, among the perquisites of the bailiffs was the groundage of every ship landed in Filey piers, with, for every ship vid, and of every coal ship 2 bushel of coals, to the bailiff for finding 2 bushel measures. Twice, in the reign of Charles I, there are conveyances of the Lennox Manor which refer to Filey Pier, its rights, members, appurtenances, and all sorts of profits. In the 19th century, when Admiral Mitford was lord of the manor, these groundage rights were confined to ships grounding on the beach to unload their cargo. The only landing remaining on the south side of Carnaze was that on the 1894 Admiralty chart, where boats used to ground to put ashore visitors to the brig. To study the erosion of Carnaze is difficult due to the small scale and questionable accuracy of the early maps and charts that are available. The Burley map of the Humber and East Riding coasts of about 1560 gives little more than an impression of Filey Bay. At its western base, Carnaze is much wider than today, especially on the south side. A strip of sand of more or less uniform width stretches to the eastern point, where there is drawn a projection pointing southeastwards, which, by comparison with the piers drawn around the harbours at Scarborough and Bridlington Quay, seems to represent the pier at Filey. 200 years later, on the Jeffreys map of Hummonby and Bridlington of 1775, the general picture of the brig and Carnaze is little changed. A pier is marked on the south side of the cliffs, which project beyond it to the area of High Brig. Beyond the cliff end, there appears to be a wide square area of rocks pointing slightly north of east. There is a suggestion that erosion was already taking place in the area of Old Quay rocks. It seems highly likely, but no more than that Jeffreys Pier was the Spital rocks of the modern Ordnance Survey maps. Carey's map of the East Riding, 1789, shows a similar picture, but is of very small scale. 19th century Admiralty charts of 1860, 1844 and 1894 show substantial erosion of the cliffs in the area of Old Quay rocks and from the eastern end of Carnaze. Some 350 yards disappeared from the length of the cliff, totally destroying the shelter for ships which had once been possible between brig and the pier or head at Filey. The cause of this spectacular loss was probably the excessive quarrying of stone from the brig and the weathering of the cliffs. The changes appear to be recorded on the 1844 Admiralty chart, which names the area from rock from High Brig eastwards Filey Brigg, and that between Carnaze and High Brig wash of the brig. The other factor in the disappearance of the anchorage was the silting up on the south side of the cliffs. Where a ship's master could expect 5 fathoms between the brig and the pier in the 17th century, the Admiralty charts showed a mere 10 feet in 1844 and 7.65 feet in the current edition. Conclusions drawn from this evidence must at best be only tentative. If the Spital rocks are the remains of the 700-yard-long pier, which was at Filey, then the possibility of ships sheltering there from northeast winds is quite likely, given a much longer extension of the Carnaze cliffs. The traditional anchorage within which manorial dues could be charged was within Filey piers. The possibility here is that the second pier was sited at Old Quay rocks, and that boats grounding between the two had their fees to pay to the lord of the manor. Cargoes discharged at Filey anchorage seem mainly to have been of fish. The earliest mention of fishing at Filey was in the late 12th century, when the fishermen were plying to Whitby and Grimsby with their catches. The monks of Whitby and the canons of Grimsby took tithe from their landings there. This was ruled to be unlawful, since all tithe from the Filey fishermen was due to the canons of Bridlington Priory. In 1231, a major dispute between the prior and the community of Filey was settled before Ralph de Neville and Simon de Cockfeld. The proctors acting for the fishermen were William Spurling, William son of Adam, Geoffrey son of Avis, and Ilorid Boosing. Men fished Dogger Bank and deducted expenses in food, drink, salt and fuel before paying the tithe of oil, by custom 40 pence a year, from each ship. Some fishermen had been tithing only at will, from 1/15 to 1/17 of their catch. The right tithe was 1/10, and was to be paid every fortnight. This probably meant that one fish in every 10 had to be put aside for the prior. Filey men were no longer to use the fishery of Crookeasy without paying tithe. Fishermen had been customarily taking 1/12 of the tithe from the large ships and boats. This was to cease. Repair of nets and lines, breakfast, etc., were to receive no subsidy from the tithe. The picture of the industry in Filey at this time is of boats and large ships travelling some distance, of net and line fishing, putting fish in salt, and of a sufficient supply of oil to make it worthwhile the prior demanding a tithe from it. A description of fishing off the Yorkshire coast, which was written in the 18th century, may help to fill in some of the gaps left by the 13th century document. Two types of boat were still in use. The cobble is 20 feet 6 inches long, 5 feet in extreme breadth, wide floored and nearly flat bottomed, about 1 ton burden, and rowed with 3 pairs of short oars or sculls, occasionally stepping a mast and hoisting a lug sail. The 5-men boat is 40 feet long, 15 broad, clinker built, and 25 tons burden. Navigated by 6 men and a boy, but called 5-men boats, from there being only so many who share in the profits of the boat. The other man and boy are hired to cook, etc., and have only their wages. 3 men man each cobble for fishing. Each of them is provided with 3 lines, which they take with them neatly coiled upon an oblong basket, constructed for the purpose. Their hooks are baited and placed regularly in the centre of the coil. Each line is furnished with 280 hooks, at 6 feet 2 inches distance from each other. The hooks are fastened to strong horsehair lines, 27 inches in length. 9 of these lines are fastened together and used as one line, which extends about 3 miles, and is furnished with above 2,500 hooks. An anchor and buoy are fixed at the first end of the line, and 1 more at each end of each man's line, in all 4 anchors and 4 buoys. The line is always laid across the current. The 5-men boats are employed in the herring fishery at Yarmouth, where they go in September and return in November, after which they generally lay their great boats up until the beginning of Lent, at which time they go off to the edge of the Dogger Bank and other places, taking 2 cobbles on board, when, upon their fishing ground, they come to anchor and fish from their boats in the same manner as those who go from the shore in a cobble. They commonly run into harbour twice a week to sell their fish. Their boats are decked at each end, but open in the middle, and carry 2 considerable lug sails. They are remarkably swift sailors, but, being very light, require great management in a heavy sea. For those who fished from the shore, Filey Bay abounded with many sorts of fish, among them small turbot, but numerous large and remarkably fine soles, which are taken either by trawl or hauling a seine or dragnet. The sale of fish at Scarborough and Filey during the 18th and 19th centuries was on the sands, as soon as the cobbles had landed. At Scarborough, the cobble boats are often run up from low water mark on wheels, with a sail set, conducted by the fishermen, who dispose of their cargo in the following manner. The intended purchaser asks the price of the cargo and bids a groat. The fisherman states a sum on the opposite extreme, as much perhaps above its worth as was bid less than its value. The one bids up and the other reduces his demand, until they meet at a reasonable point, when the purchaser suddenly exclaims, "Het!" Thus the sale is concluded. The size of the sales at Filey cannot have been great, since fish tithe was only collected from 9 boat owners in 1840 and from 9 yawls in 1841. In the 13th century, matters were different. The tenant of the 5.5 bovates of land at Filey was often an influential man, well able to extract privileges from the lord of the manor of Hummonby. The size of the trade in fish and victuals was sufficient for Gilbert de Grant to grant the de Neville family a Friday market and a fair on the day and eve of St. Bartholomew at Filey, on condition that a moiety of the fruits and profits arising from the market and fair, from tolls and stallage, from the amends of the assize of bread and ales, should go to de Gant. They could have a joint bailiff, or each could have his own and collect his dues on sea and on land. This is the earliest hint of the groundage charges to ships, which are mentioned in the extent of 1600. By 1241, Gilbert de Gant was complaining that William de Neville's market at Filey was injuring his own at Hummonby. This led to the official suppression of the market during the reign of Henry III. But since the collection of the tolls went on for about 100 years after the initial complaint, the effectiveness of the order to suppress the market must be questioned. Entries in the state papers show the toll as being divided between the de Tattersall family, who held Hummonby, and the de Malabis, who held Filey, the toll being raised from the sales of fish and victuals. In 1288, half the toll was valued at 13 shillings and 4 pence per year. In 1303, it was worth 14 shillings. In 1307, together with 1/3 of Hummonby market, the income was 49 shillings and 4 pence farthing. The last mention of the profits from the fair and town of Filey was in 1336, when the dower lands of Joan de Tattersall were divided. Actual mention of Filey market occurs twice in this period. In 1293, it appears that Richard de Malabis was quietly holding his market and fair, with tumbril, pillory, and amends of the assize of bread and ales as before. The last reference to the market is in 1316-17. From the middle of the 14th century, mention of these dues ceases, together with references to the keepers of the port of Filey. This seems to be associated with a decline in trade in the area. In 1382, Robert de Roos of Gedney held 1/3 of the decayed market of Hummonby. In 1389, of John de Clifton's holding in Hummonby, it was said that 1/3 of the perquisites of the court there and of the market and fair are worth nothing by the year beyond the fees of the steward, clerk, and bailiff. It was perhaps at this period that the old quay at Filey started to fall into disrepair. How far the decline in trade contributed to this is difficult to say, by comparison with other factors such as the silting up of the anchorage within the piers, or erosion caused by changes in sea level, or by the excessive quarrying of stone from the Brigg and Carnays. It seems from a reference to a pasture called de Erlehang in 1337 that there were lands that flooded in Filey Bay, but beyond that evidence is lacking. The right to quarry stone in Filey parish is a very ancient one, first seen in the late 12th century in the Chartulery of Bridlington, when Ralph de Neville, son of Ralph, granted to the canons stone in the quarry of Filey for the building of the monastery and offices, to be delved and taken at their charges, and a good free way over the cliff of the quarry for the length of the said cliff in the place called Lehoke, and everywhere else where they can find rock. Lehoke, or the Hook, was apparently the obvious place in Filey where rock was available, and it may well be that the Brigg is referred to, but there is no direct evidence linking these two names. The right of quarrying stone from the Brigg, and of taking gravel from the beach between high and low water marks, occurs again in the manorial rights exercised by Admiral Mitford in the 19th century. His account books show gravel being sold to surveyors of the highway at 3d. a ton, and stone to those who wanted it. At Hummonby Hall, the ruined entrance gate was built with stone from the Brigg. People who took stone without permission were prosecuted. Comparison of the charts of 1844 and 1894 show the effects of this quarrying in the Badlands type of erosion to form Old Quay Hole. and the final destruction of Wooldale now merely the name for a stretch of cliff. The nature of the trade coming through Filey, apart from fish and victuals, is difficult to assess. The mention of coal ships in the extent of 1600 is significant. Coal ships still came to Filey in the 19th century. The account book of Bertram Osbaldeston Mitford for 1837 records the purchase of 3 tons of coal at 19 shillings a ton on May 2nd. In the period 1872 to 5, in a list of ships discharging cargo at Filey, the Maria of 38 tons made 73 voyages carrying coal, and the Admiral Mitford of 42 tons made 4 voyages. Deals and timber were listed as cargo for the Indiana and Felicity, each of which made 1 voyage in the period. Lists of cargo from wreck at Filey suggest the possibility of ships landing wool, cloth or hides, but there is no direct evidence of this. In summary, the port of Filey was one of many places of refuge and for the discharge of cargo on the east coast during the medieval period. The anchorage within the piers was most likely on the south side of Carnaze and was used from at least 1200 to sometime shortly after 1600. Old Key Rocks is the site of the medieval pier, with the Spital rocks apparently being the head referred to in 16th century pilot books. Silting, erosion and quarrying caused the disappearance of the anchorage.